Maya showed us on a Sunday. Not just me. Both of us. She sat us down at the kitchen table at 11 in the morning, and she said, "I need to show you both something. I need you both to see it at the same time. I'm 11 years old," she said, "and I have been doing a project. I want to tell you what the project is first, before I show you, because I want you to understand why I did it this way." She said, "Grandma Diane says things to me about Mom when Dad is not there. She has been saying them for a long time. I did not tell anyone because I did not want to cause problems, and I thought maybe I was misunderstanding. Then I decided that the best way to know if I was misunderstanding was to have a record. So I made one." She put the old iPad on the table, the one that had been replaced 2 years ago, and that she had been using for reading and games, and that I had not thought about in months. She said, "I have been running a recording every visit to Grandma Diane's house for 3 months. I have 7 recordings. I have gone through all of them, and I have written down the parts I think you need to hear." She said, "I showed you both at the same time because I wanted Dad to see it the same moment as Mom." She looked at Matt. She said, "So that nobody had to take anyone's word for it." Matt looked at the iPad. He looked at Maya. He said, "Okay." She pressed play. "My name is Jess. I am 38 years old. Matt is 40. Maya is 11, and she is the most organized person in our house by a distance, and has been since she was approximately 8 years old when she started keeping a notebook of things she wanted to remember. The notebook had sections. Things that are important. Things I want to understand better. Things that are not fair and should be different." She had shown me the notebook once when she was 9, and I had asked if I could read it. She had said, "Some parts. The things I want to understand better," she had said. "Those are mine for now." I had said, "Of course." I had not thought about it since. I was thinking about it now. Sitting at the kitchen table on a Sunday morning, watching my 11-year-old daughter open a folder on the replaced iPad that she had titled, in her own careful handwriting on the folder label she had stuck to the back of the case, "Fair Record." Let me tell you about Diane before I tell you what was in the recordings. Because the fair record did not come from nowhere. It came from a very long history of small things that I had noticed and Matt had, sometimes noticed, and which had always existed in the gap between what could be demonstrated and what was only felt. Diane is 62 years old. She is Matt's mother, and she had, from the beginning of our marriage, a very particular relationship with the idea of me. Not with me personally, with the idea of me. The idea of me was a woman who had arrived in her son's life and reorganized it in ways she had not approved and could not reverse. Before me, Matt had been living in an apartment in the city, working in a field he had been excited about, and had not yet committed to long term. He had been vaguely planning to spend a year in New York. He had been, in Diane's narration of his life, free and open and full of potential. Then I had arrived, and 3 years later he had moved to the town where I was from, where my family was, where my work was. He had transferred offices. He had made the choice. He had made it clearly and without pressure, and with what I observed to be genuine enthusiasm. He had made the choice, and Diane had never, in 8 years, accepted the choice as his. She had accepted it as mine. She had accepted it as something that had happened to her son, rather than something her son had done. She had said things at the edges of gatherings. She had said things in the particular register of someone who frames observations as concern. She had said, "Matt always gave so much up for this family." She had said, "Matt is so selfless." Both statements were compliments to Matt. Both statements carried, in the specific way she delivered them, a negative inference about what the family had cost him. I had raised this with Matt 4 times over 8 years. Each time he had spoken to her. Each time she had said she had not meant it that way. Each time the meaning had returned in a different sentence. I had learned to carry it in the specific way of a person who has been told 4 times that something did not mean what it clearly meant and who has chosen to stop trying to demonstrate the meaning to someone who will always decline to see it. I had not known that Maya was also carrying it. I had not known that Maya had been assessing it for longer than I had understood. I had not known that at 11 years old, my daughter had decided that the right response to a thing that could not be demonstrated was to document it until it could. Fair record. She had named it herself. She had understood something that I had taken 8 years to fully articulate. The problem was not what Diane was saying. The problem was the absence of a witness. The recordings. I will tell you what was in them in the order Maya had organized them, which was not chronological but thematic. She had gone through all 7 recordings, which totaled 4 hours and 37 minutes of footage. And she had categorized what she found. She showed us her document before she played the clips. It was a real document, created in the notes application on the old iPad, with dates, timestamps, and quotation marks around the exact words. I looked at the document before I heard anything and I thought, she made a document first. She went through 4 hours and 37 minutes of footage, and she made a document with timestamps before she showed us anything. She is 11 years old. She said, I organized it into categories. She said the categories were things said about Mom, things said about where we live, things said about what Dad gave up, things about coming to live with Grandma. She said, I have 3 clips for each category. I did not use all the recordings, only the parts that were clear. She had, in other words, edited 4 hours and 37 minutes to the 12 clips she considered most evidentiary. At 11 years old. I looked at Matt. His face was doing something careful. He was reading the document. He was reading the quotation marks. Let me tell you some of what was in the quotation marks. Under things said about Mom. Your mum means well, but she has never really understood what makes your dad happy, the way I understand him. Under things said about where we live. This town was never where your dad was going to end up. It is a good town, but it was not his town. He came here because that is where your mum's people are. Under things said about what Dad gave up. Before your mum, your dad was going to go to New York. He had a plan. He would have had a real life. He gave it up. And that is very generous. But I want you to know that he had a plan. Under things about coming to live with Grandma. If things ever felt very hard at home, if it ever felt like too much, you can always come to me. I will always have room for you. This is between us, okay? Your mum and dad have enough to think about. We said this because it was special, not because it was a secret, but because it is ours. Matt had stopped reading. He was looking at the last quotation. I will always have room for you. This is between us, he said. That is. He stopped. He said, play them. Maya pressed play. The recording quality was good. The old iPad had a better microphone than I had expected. You could hear Diane's voice clearly. You could hear the warm, confidential tone of it. The particular register she used when she was saying things to Maya that she would not say if anyone else was in the room. You could hear Maya's responses, careful and neutral. The responses of a child who had learned to receive information she was not going to validate or reject. Just, and, okay, and I see. And once, in the 4th clip, after Diane had described what Matt had given up in coming here, Maya said nothing at all. There was a silence. Then she said, should we have the biscuits now? Diane said, yes, let's have the biscuits. I heard that silence on the recording, and I understood that the silence was Maya deciding something. It was the specific silence of a child who has heard something that has confirmed something they were already measuring and who is not going to respond to it, because to respond to it would be to acknowledge it, and acknowledging it would mean it was in the room between them, and she did not want it in the room. She wanted it in the document. The biscuits, not the acknowledgement. The record, not the conversation. She was 11 years old and she had understood something that most adults I know have not figured out. You do not correct a person who will not be corrected. You document them until the record can speak for itself. Matt watched all 12 clips. He watched them without speaking. He watched his mother's voice in his daughter's categorized document, timestamp by timestamp, quotation mark by quotation mark. He watched the clip where Diane said, "Your dad had a plan," and he watched the clip where she said, "He would have had a real life," and he watched the clip where she said, "This is between us. This is ours. Not a secret." He watched all of it. When the last clip finished, he sat at the kitchen table with his hands flat on the surface. I had seen that posture before. I had seen it in March after the school called about Lily. I had seen it in the particular way that men sit when something has collapsed the frame they had been holding up. He was not angry in the hot external way. He was angry in the deep internal way of a person who has understood something that changes the shape of several years at once. He said, "Maya." She said, "Yes." He said, "How long have you been building this?" She said, 3 months. "The recordings are from October, November, and December." He said, "Before the recordings." She said, "She has been saying things for longer than 3 months. I noticed it when I was 9. I did not know what to do with it." He said, "Why did you not tell us?" She said, "I did not want to cause problems if I was wrong." She said, "And I did not think you would both believe me the same way if I just told you." She said, "I thought if only Mom heard it, Grandma Diane would say Mom was making it up or exaggerating." She said, "And if only Dad heard it, I thought he might not believe it about his own mum." She said, "I wanted you both to hear the same thing at the same time." She said, "So that nobody had to take anyone's word for it." Matt looked at me. His eyes were doing what eyes do when they are looking for somewhere to put something very large. I said nothing. He looked back at Maya. He said, "That was the right way to handle it." She said, "I know." He said, "Maya." He said, "What Grandma Diane said about your mum." He said, "I want you to hear something clearly." He said, "This town is not where I ended up. This is where I chose to be." He said, "I want you to say that back to me." She said, "This is where you chose to be." He said, "Not because of your mum. Not instead of something else. Because I looked at what I had and where I was, and I made a choice." He said, "I want you to know that because you have been carrying a different story in your grandmother's words for 2 years, and I want to replace it with the correct one." She looked at him. She said, "I think I knew the correct one." She said, "That is partly why I started the project." I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "Because Grandma Diane was so certain about what Dad had given up, and I lived with Dad every day and what I saw did not match." She said, "You seemed happy." She said, "Not happy like a person who had given up something. Happy like a person who was where they wanted to be." She said, "That is why I knew she was wrong." She said, "But I wanted the record to show it." She said, "So that it was not just what I thought I saw." Matt said, "Maya." He said, "I love you so much." She said, "I know." She said, "Should I leave you to talk?" He said, "Yes." She went to her room. He sat at the table. He said, "She has been carrying this for 2 years." I said, "Yes." He said, "At 9 years old she started noticing." I said, "Yes." He said, "And she built a documentation system." I said, "Yes." He was quiet. Then he said, "My mother has been spending time alone with our daughter, telling her that her mother traps people here and that her father had a better life before us." I said, Yes. He said, I am going to call her right now. I said, I know. Let me tell you how Maya ran the project. Because I asked her, eventually. And she explained it to me in full, and the explanation deserves to be part of this account. She had taken the old iPad to Diane's house on 3 consecutive Saturdays before she began recording. She had tested the audio in different rooms. She had found that in the kitchen, where most of the conversations happened, the iPad picked up clearly from inside the bag if the bag was left open on the chair beside her. She had tested the battery. A full charge lasted 8 hours, which was longer than any visit. She had found a setting in the recording application that kept the screen dark while recording, so that no light would show from inside the bag. She had tested this at home by putting the iPad in the bag and recording herself talking for 20 minutes and then playing it back. She had done this 3 times before the first real recording. She said, when she told me this, I wanted to make sure it worked before I used it. I did not want bad recordings, I wanted good ones. I said, you tested it at home first? She said, yes. 3 times. She said, I also read the rules about recording in our state. She said, in our state, one-party consent is sufficient for audio recording. She said, I am one of the parties because I am present. I said, where did you read about one-party consent? She said, online. She said, I searched. Is it legal to record a conversation you are part of? She had searched the legal framework for recording consent before beginning the project. She had read state law at 11 years old to confirm her method was within its bounds. I sat with that for a moment. She said, I wanted to make sure I was doing it the right way. Not just effective. Right. She said, because if I did it the wrong way, it might not count. I said, Maya, I said, you verified the legal framework. She said, yes. I said, before running a 3-month recording project on your grandmother. She said, yes. She said, I did not want it to be inadmissible. She used the word inadmissible. I said, where did you learn that word? She said, from the legal research. I said, of course. I looked at her for a long moment. I said, I want to tell you something. She said, okay. I said, what you built was extraordinary. Not because of the outcome, though the outcome was important. Because of the way you built it. You checked the method. You checked the law. You collected enough to be certain, not just enough to feel sure. You showed both of us at the same time because you understood that the witness needs to be undeniable. She said, I know. She said, that is what I was trying to do. I said, you did it. She said, good. Then she went back to whatever she had been doing. She is 12 years old. She will be a lawyer. The framework she built at 11 was more methodical than half the complaints I have seen adults make about people who have wronged them. She checked the law. She tested the equipment. She collected sufficient evidence across multiple occasions. She presented it to both decision-makers simultaneously. She documented the categories. She cited the timestamps. She closed the loop. Fair record. That is the whole method, and it took her 3 months, and it is the most effective thing anyone in this family has done in 8 years of a problem that had no witness. Matt called Diane that afternoon. He called from the kitchen. I was in the kitchen. He did not ask me to leave. He put the phone on the table between us. I could hear both sides. He said, I need to talk to you about the conversations you have been having with Maya. Diane said, what conversations? The speed was wrong. She had said it too quickly for it to be genuine uncertainty. He said, I have recordings, Mum. He said, Maya made recordings of 7 visits over 3 months. He said, I have heard them. Diane said, she was recording me without my knowledge. Matt said, yes. He said, I am aware that that is what happened. He said, What I would like to talk about is what you were saying while she was recording. Diane said, I was speaking to my grandchild. I was having conversations with her. Matt said, I would like you to tell me what you said to her about her mother. Diane was quiet. Then she said, I was expressing my honest feelings. Matt said, Your honest feelings about what? She said, About the choices you made. About what this town meant for your options. Matt said, What choices I made? Diane said, You were going to New York. You had a plan. Matt said, I was 29 years old and I had a vague idea. He said, It was not a plan. He said, It was a thing I had said once that you stored for 8 years and built into a narrative about what I sacrificed. Diane said, I was there. I know what you said. Matt said, Yes, you were there. And you heard what you needed to hear, and you kept it, and you used it on my 11-year-old daughter. He said, You told her I would have had a real life. He said those words. She said, I was speaking honestly. He said, Mum. He said, I need you to understand something. He said, Maya has been carrying your narrative for 2 years. He said, She is 11 years old. He said, She has been sitting with your version of her father's life for 2 years, measuring it against what she actually observed, and deciding that her observations were more trustworthy than your version. He said, She built a documentation project to establish that her observations were correct. He said, At 11 years old. He said, Because your narrative was the alternative and she knew your narrative was wrong. Diane said, I was not trying to harm Maya. Matt said, I know that. He said, But you told her that this family was something that happened to me, rather than something I chose. He said, You told that to a child. He said, You told her that for 2 years. He said, And you asked her to keep it between you. Not a secret, but ours. He said those words. He had remembered the quotation from the document. Not a secret, but ours. He said, That is asking a child to carry information that is designed to diminish her mother's place in this family, and to feel that the carrying of it is a form of closeness with you. He said, That is not closeness. He said, That is a weight. Diane said, I love Maya. He said, I know you do. He said, You can love Maya and still have done something that was not good for her. He said, Both things are true. He said, I am telling you now that there will be no unsupervised visits for a period of time. He said, That means no visits without Jess or me present. He said, When the visits are right again, they will be on different terms. He said, Because the terms we had allowed you to say things to our daughter that I have now heard in her own documentation system. He said, The terms are going to change. Diane said, Matt. He said, Yes. She said, I am sorry. She said, I am telling you that I am sorry. Matt said, I hear that. He said, I will talk to you in a few days. He hung up. He sat at the kitchen table. He said, Unsupervised visits are paused. I said, Yes. He said, There will be supervised visits eventually. On different terms. I said, Yes. He said, I need to go talk to Maya. I said, Yes. He stood up. He stopped in the doorway. He said, She made a document. He said, 4 hours and 37 minutes of recordings, and she made a document with categories and timestamps. I said, Yes. She is 11. I said, I know. He said, She is extraordinary. I said, I know. He went to find her. I sat at the kitchen table in the silence of a Sunday afternoon, where something had shifted and the shape of the shift was still settling. I picked up the old iPad. I looked at the folder label. Fair record. 2 words in careful handwriting on a sticker she had put on the case. 2 words that had required 3 months of sitting in her grandmother's kitchen, saying, "Mummy and okay. And should we have the biscuits now?" while a recording ran in the bag beside her. 2 words that had required, before the recordings, 2 years of patient observation, and the decision that observation alone was insufficient. 2 words that had changed everything in a Sunday morning kitchen. Fair record. That is my daughter. 6 months have passed since the Sunday. Let me tell you where things are. Diane has had supervised visits. They have been different in the way that supervised visits are different. More careful, more surface, more managed. She has been to 3 family dinners. She has been warm with Maya. Maya has been polite and somewhat measured in the particular way of a child who has assessed a person and updated her assessment. She calls her Grandma Diane still. She is not cold. She is not warm in the former way. She is, at 11, making a calibrated choice about the level of trust she offers. And the calibration is her own, and I am not going to adjust it on anyone's behalf. The visits are what they are. Matt and Diane have had 2 separate conversations beyond the initial one. I was not present for those. He told me what was in them. In the first, Diane had said that she was carrying grief about his life that she had never properly expressed. She had said that she had watched him make choices, and had told herself she was accepting them while actually storing an alternative version of his life that she preferred. She had said she had not fully realized she was doing this until she heard herself saying it in his daughter's recordings. Matt had said, "That is honest." He had said, "Thank you for that." In the second conversation, Diane had asked what she needed to do. Matt had said, "You need to understand that the story you were telling Maya is not the story of my life," he said. "The story of my life is the one I have made here." He said, "With Jess." He said, "In this house." He said, "With Maya." He said, "I need you to not tell my daughter an alternative version of her father's life that diminishes the family she grew up in." Diane had said, "Yes." She had said, "I understand that now." Matt had said, "Good." He had said, "Then that is what we build from. We are building from there. I do not know what the building will look like in a year. I know that the foundation is different from what it was before the Sunday, and that the difference is documented, which means it is real in a way that things without documentation are not always real." Let me tell you what Maya said. 6 months after the Sunday, in the kitchen on a Tuesday afternoon, she was doing her homework at the table and I was making tea, and she said, without looking up from the homework, "I am glad I showed you both at the same time." I said, "Why?" She said, "Because it meant you both knew it was true." She said, "Nobody had to take anyone's word for it." She said, "The record was the word." I said, "Yes." She said, "I want to be a lawyer when I grow up." She said it in the tone of someone who has just made a decision, rather than someone who is announcing something they have thought about for a long time. I said, "You would be a very good one." She said, "I know." She went back to her homework. I made the tea. Outside, it was an ordinary Tuesday, in the particular way of ordinary Tuesdays when nothing has to happen because the things that needed to happen already happened on a Sunday 6 months ago. She had built a fair record at 11 years old because she had understood that the absence of a witness is the thing that lets unjust things continue. She had understood that the record itself can be the witness. She had been 9 when she first noticed the pattern. She had been 11 when she built the instrument that changed it. She is 12 now and she wants to be a lawyer, and I believe her completely. That is the whole story. Every word of it true. Every word mine. Here is my question for you. If you found out that your male had been telling your child, during unsupervised visits, that their parent had given up a better life, and your child had been building a documentation project for 3 months to show you, what would your first response to your child be? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. One more thing. About the biscuit moment. The fourth clip. The moment where Diane has described what Matt gave up in coming to this town. And then there is a silence. And then Maya says, "Should we have the biscuits now?" I have thought about that moment many times. Not the thing Diane said, which was unjust but predictable. The silence. The specific silence of a child who has heard something and decided not to respond to it. I have been in rooms where adults heard unjust things and responded immediately in the way of people who have not yet figured out that responding immediately can be its own trap. Maya sat in that silence and decided, not the acknowledgement. The record. The biscuits and the record. Not the argument and the rupture. The document and the Sunday morning. 2 words on a sticker on a replaced iPad. Fair record. That is still the most clarifying thing I have ever seen done by anyone in our family. She is 12 now. She still has the notebook with the sections. Things that are important. Things I want to understand better. Things that are not fair and should be different. I do not ask to read it. Some parts are hers for now. But I think the fair record would go in the last section, and the outcome of it would go in the first. The record was fair. The outcome was important. She made both happen at 11 years old with an old iPad and a sticker, and 3 months of biscuits and silence and the specific patience of someone who understood that the truth does not need a moment. It needs a record. That is the end.